When I came home from my 12-hour shift, my wife said, "This pigsty is embarrassing. What do you even do all day?" She was standing in the living room, wearing fresh highlights that cost $300 and nails that cost another $100, and holding shopping bags from her 4th trip to the mall this week, while pointing at a single cup I'd left on the coffee table before my 5 o'clock shift. "Rebecca, I just worked 12 hours at the warehouse. You've been home all day." She laughed and sat down on the couch she'd bought last month for $4,000 that we couldn't afford. "I've been busy too. The salon took 4 hours. These highlights don't just happen. Then I had lunch with Brittany and we went shopping. I'm exhausted." She kicked off designer shoes that cost more than I made in a week. "You went shopping again? The credit cards are maxed." She rolled her eyes. "I needed new workout clothes. How am I supposed to stay attractive for you if I don't have proper athleisure?" She hadn't worked out once since buying the $800 Peloton that was now a clothing rack. "Rebecca, the dishes are piled up. The laundry hasn't been done in 2 weeks. The bathroom is growing things." She stood up angry. "So clean it. You live here too. Why is housework always my job?" She hadn't had a job in 3 years. "Because I work 60 hours a week to pay for your shopping and you're home all day doing nothing." She gasped like I'd slapped her. "Nothing? I maintain myself. Do you know how much work it is to look this good? The skincare routine alone takes 2 hours." She spent 2 hours putting on creams that cost more than our groceries. "Then after skincare, I have to plan my outfit, check social media, book appointments, maintain friendships. I don't have time for housework." She said this while unemployed, living off my salary. "Your friends are all unemployed wives who spend their days shopping." She got defensive. "We're not unemployed. We're homemakers focusing on self-care and wellness." None of them made homes. They made credit card debt. "What home are you making? The house is filthy. We've eaten takeout for 6 months because you won't cook." She pulled out her phone. "Cooking is outdated. Modern women order in. It supports local restaurants." Supporting restaurants we couldn't afford while she bought ingredients that rotted in our fridge because she didn't know how to cook. "I found moldy food from 2 months ago in the vegetable drawer." She shrugged. "So throw it out. Why is that my problem?" Everything was her problem because she created it, but refused to solve it. "Rebecca, I leave at 5 a.m. and get home at 7 p.m. When exactly should I clean?" She had an answer ready. "Weekends. Other husbands manage to keep houses clean while working. Other husbands had wives who contributed something. Those husbands have partners who help. You spend weekends at the spa." She got angry. "Self-care isn't selfish. My therapist says I need to prioritize myself." Her therapist, whom she paid $200 an hour, validated her laziness. "Your therapist also says you have anxiety about working, but you seem fine shopping." She started crying. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Having to look perfect all the time. Keeping up with social expectations. It's exhausting." The only expectation was that she contribute anything to our marriage. "I'm asking you to wash a dish. Maybe vacuum once a month." She threw herself on the couch dramatically. "This is emotional abuse, expecting me to be your maid while I'm dealing with my mental health." Her mental health prevented housework, never shopping. "What about my mental health? Working myself to death while you complain about the house you won't clean?" She stopped crying immediately. "That's different. Men don't have the same emotional complexity. You just go to work and turn your brain off." I lifted boxes all day, calculating how many I needed to lift to pay for her latest purchases. "I'm done, Rebecca. Clean the house or get out." She laughed. "Get out? This is my house too. Community property. I get half of everything. Half of the debt she created. Then you can have half the housework." She stood up furious. "Fine. I'll show you how hard housework is. I'll clean tomorrow and you'll see why I can't do it regularly." The next day I came home to her on the couch crying again. "I tried to clean, but I broke a nail. Look." She showed me a slightly chipped $150 manicure. "That's your excuse? A chipped nail?" She nodded seriously. "It's traumatic. Plus the cleaning chemicals might damage my skin. I have sensitive skin." Her skin survived chemical peels and acid treatments at spas. "Then wear gloves." She looked disgusted. "Rubber gloves? Like a servant?" "I don't think so." That night I stopped at the store and bought cleaning supplies. The next morning, instead of going to work, I called in sick for the first time in 5 years. Rebecca left at 9 for her hair appointment that would take all day. I cleaned everything. Every dish, every surface, every piece of laundry. The house was spotless. Then I packed her belongings. I started with her closet because that's where most of the damage lived. Designer dresses with tags still attached hung next to blouses she wore once for a photo. I pulled each hanger down and folded the clothes into cardboard boxes I'd picked up from the warehouse. A silk top that cost $200 went in the same box as workout leggings she never sweated in. Every item reminded me of an argument we'd had about money. I taped the first box shut and felt something loosen in my chest. The bedroom took 3 hours because she owned so much stuff. Shoes filled 6 boxes alone. I found receipts in her nightstand drawer showing purchases from last week, even though she knew the cards were maxed. By noon, I'd packed 10 boxes and the house looked bigger somehow. I moved faster after lunch and finished the bathroom in under an hour. All those expensive creams and serums went into a plastic tub. The living room was last, and I stacked everything by the front door where she'd see it immediately. 23 boxes total, plus the tub of beauty products. I sat on the couch and waited. Rebecca came through the door at 6:15 with shopping bags in both hands and her hair freshly colored. She stopped when she saw the boxes and the bags slipped from her fingers. She stared at the stack without moving or speaking for what felt like forever. Then she screamed so loud I thought the neighbors would call the police. She said I couldn't just kick her out of her own house and demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I stayed seated on the couch and kept my voice calm when I told her she had 2 choices. She could start contributing equally to housework and finances starting immediately, or she could move out by the end of the week. She called me an abuser and said I was forcing her onto the streets like she was homeless. She pulled out her phone and said she was going to tell everyone what kind of monster I really was. I didn't argue or defend myself, because there was nothing left to say that we hadn't already said 100 times. Rebecca ran to the bedroom and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. I heard her voice through the door talking fast and angry to someone on the phone. Within 40 minutes, a car pulled up outside, and her friend Chelsea came to the door without knocking. She glared at me like I'd committed a crime and went straight to the bedroom. Their voices carried through the house while I made myself dinner for the first time in 6 months. I scrambled eggs and made toast and ate at the kitchen table in silence. They talked for hours about what a terrible husband I was and how I'd blindsided Rebecca without warning. I washed my plate and went to watch television while they kept talking. Around 11, Chelsea came out and told me I should be ashamed of myself. I nodded and said nothing because arguing with her wouldn't change anything. Chelsea finally left after midnight, and the house went quiet. I was half asleep on the couch when Rebecca came out of the bedroom carrying 2 suitcases. She'd changed into sweatpants and her face was red from crying. She said she was staying with Chelsea temporarily, but this marriage wasn't over, and I couldn't get rid of her that easily. She grabbed her makeup case and a few outfits from the boxes, but left everything else stacked by the door. She told me I'd regret this and she'd make sure everyone knew what I'd done to her. Then she left, and the house was silent for the first time in 3 years. I locked the door behind her and slept better than I had in months, even though I knew tomorrow would be harder. The next morning, I called my brother Johnny before my shift started. He answered on the second ring, and I told him everything that had happened in the past 2 days. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said I should have done this 2 years ago. He told me Rebecca had been taking advantage of me since she quit her job, and everyone in the family could see it except me. He offered to help me figure out the next steps, and gave me the name of a divorce attorney his friend had used. I wrote down the number and thanked him for not judging me. He said there was nothing to judge because I'd finally stood up for myself, and that took guts. We talked for another 10 minutes before I had to leave for work, and he made me promise to call the attorney today. I used my lunch break to call the warehouse supervisor and request a personal day. He approved it without asking questions because I'd never called out sick or taken time off in 5 years. I drove straight to the attorney's office after my shift ended. Danielle Pratt worked out of a small building downtown, and her receptionist led me to a conference room with a long table. Danielle came in 5 minutes later carrying a yellow legal pad and sat across from me. She had gray hair and sharp eyes and asked me to explain my situation from the beginning. I told her about Rebecca's unemployment and spending habits and refusal to do housework. I showed her credit card statements on my phone that went back 3 years. She took notes while I talked and didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said Rebecca's unemployment actually worked in my favor regarding asset division because she hadn't contributed to household income. Danielle told me to document everything before we filed any papers. She wanted records of the debt Rebecca created and her refusal to work or do housework and the spending patterns. I realized I had credit card statements going back 3 years that told the whole story. She said to print them out and highlight the purchases that were clearly Rebecca's personal spending. She also told me to write down specific incidents where Rebecca refused to do housework or complained about being asked to contribute. I took notes on my phone while she talked and felt relieved that someone finally understood what I'd been dealing with. We scheduled another meeting for next week, and she said not to communicate with Rebecca except through text so everything was documented. I left her office feeling like I'd made the right decision for the first time in years. That evening, I spread credit card statements across the kitchen table and started going through them line by line. Every statement showed purchases from stores Rebecca loved and restaurants she wanted to try to salons she visited weekly. I highlighted charges in yellow and added them up month by month. The first year of her unemployment, she spent $18,000. The second year was $26,000. The third year was 36,000 and still counting. I felt sick seeing the numbers written down because it was real money I'd earned lifting boxes in a warehouse. $80,000 in 3 years while she contributed nothing to household income and complained that I didn't appreciate her. I printed everything and put it in a folder for Danielle and tried not to think about all the things we could have done with that money if Rebecca had just gotten a job. My phone buzzed around 9 and Rebecca's name appeared on the screen. The text said, I needed to apologize and let her come home immediately. I didn't respond because Danielle told me to keep communication minimal. Rebecca sent another text 5 minutes later, asking if I was ignoring her. Then another saying she couldn't believe I was being so cruel. The texts kept coming every few minutes and went from angry to sad to threatening. She said I was destroying our marriage over nothing, and everyone would side with her when they heard the truth. She said her therapist agreed I was being emotionally abusive by forcing her out. She said she'd take me for everything in the divorce and I'd regret ever crossing her. By the time I went to bed, she'd sent 15 messages, and I hadn't responded to any of them. I turned my phone on silent and fell asleep, knowing tomorrow would bring more of the same, but at least I'd finally taken the first step toward getting my life back. The next morning at the warehouse, I went through the motions of scanning boxes and loading pallets, but my mind kept replaying the previous day. Carlos walked past my station twice before he stopped and crossed his arms. He watched me miss a scan and have to redo it. You good? I nodded and kept working. He didn't move. You sure? Because you've worked here 4 years and I've never seen you miss a scan. I set down the scanner and looked at him, going through some stuff at home. He nodded slowly and gestured toward his office. Take 5. I followed him into the small room that smelled like coffee and cardboard. He sat on the edge of his desk and waited. I'm separating from my wife. The words came out easier than I expected. He didn't look surprised. Yeah? How long you been married? 6 years. She hasn't worked in 3 and won't do anything around the house. I finally told her to leave. Carlos rubbed his jaw. I went through something similar about 5 years back. My ex spent money like water and acted like I was the problem for noticing. I felt something loosen in my chest, knowing someone else understood. It's been building for years, but I finally hit my limit. He pulled a business card from his desk drawer and handed it to me. This is a credit counselor. Good guy, he'll help you figure out the financial mess before it gets worse. I took the card and put it in my pocket. Thanks. Carlos stood up. Also, we've got overtime available if you need extra money for legal fees, as much as you want. I thanked him again and went back to my station feeling like maybe I wasn't completely alone in this. Lunch break came at noon, and I sat in my car eating the sandwich I'd packed that morning. My phone showed 3 new texts from Rebecca, but I ignored them. Someone knocked on my window and I looked up to see Ryan from the loading dock. I rolled down the window. Hey man, there's someone at the main entrance asking for you. My stomach dropped. Who? He made a face. Your wife, I think? She's crying pretty hard. I got out of the car and walked toward the front of the building. Rebecca stood near the security gate wearing sweatpants and one of my old hoodies with her hair in a messy bun. Her face was red and blotchy. She saw me and started crying harder. Please just talk to me. The security guard looked uncomfortable. I walked closer but stayed on my side of the gate. What are you doing here, Rebecca? She wiped her nose with her sleeve. You won't answer my texts. I had to see you. Several of my coworkers had gathered near the loading bay watching. I'm at work. You can't just show up here. She reached through the gate toward me. I'm sorry, okay? I'll do better. I'll clean the house and cook and everything. Just let me come home. I stepped back from her hand. It's too late for that. She sobbed louder, and the security guard shifted his weight. Please don't do this. I love you. I need you. Ryan appeared next to me and spoke quietly. Hey man, if she keeps doing this, you might want to think about a restraining order. Rebecca heard him and turned her crying into anger. Who the hell are you? Ryan ignored her and looked at me. Just saying. This isn't normal. I nodded and turned back to Rebecca. Go back to Chelsea's house. We'll talk through lawyers. She screamed that I was ruining her life, and the security guard asked her to leave. She finally walked away, still crying, and got into Chelsea's car that was parked down the street. I went back to work but couldn't focus for the rest of the day. That evening, I drove to the address on the card Carlos gave me. The credit counselor worked out of a small office above a tax preparation place. His name was on the door in faded gold letters. I knocked and a voice told me to come in. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain. You must be the warehouse referral. Carlos called ahead. I sat in the chair across from his desk. Yeah, I need help figuring out my debt situation. He pulled out a yellow legal pad. Tell me everything. I spent an hour going through our finances while he took notes. He asked about Rebecca's spending habits and our income and the credit cards. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and whistled. You're $45,000 in debt, almost all of it from the last 3 years based on these dates. Hearing the number out loud made my hands shake. Can I fix it? He nodded. Yeah, but it'll take time. First thing is you need to stop any new spending. Cut up the cards. Second, we make a payment plan starting with highest interest rates. He walked me through a budget that would have me debt-free in 4 years if I stayed disciplined. This assumes your wife doesn't add more debt. I told him about the separation and he made a note. Good. That'll help. Once the divorce is final, her spending isn't your problem anymore. We scheduled another meeting for next month, and I left feeling like I had a path forward, even if it was a long one. 2 days later, Danielle called and said she'd filed the separation papers. Rebecca will be served at the address you gave me, Chelsea's place. I was at home cleaning the kitchen when she called. How long until she gets them? Danielle shuffled papers on her end. Process server is going this afternoon. Expect a reaction. The reaction came 3 hours later. My phone rang and Rebecca's name appeared. I almost didn't answer, but Danielle said to document everything. Hello? Rebecca was screaming, so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. You're really doing this? You filed papers? I kept my voice calm. Yes, we're separated. She called me every name she could think of. You're ruining my life. I'll make sure you lose everything in the divorce. The house, the car, everything. I let her yell until she ran out of breath. Are you done? She started crying again. How can you be so cold? Don't you care about me at all? I did care, or at least I used to, but I was too tired to keep trying. Goodbye, Rebecca. I hung up and she called back immediately. I sent it to voicemail. She called 6 more times before finally stopping. That night, I slept through the night for the first time in months. The air mattress I'd bought at the discount store squeaked every time I moved, but I didn't care. Rebecca had taken the expensive bed during her first trip back to get clothes, and I wasn't about to buy another one while drowning in debt. I woke up at 5 without an alarm and looked around the bedroom. The house was completely silent. No sounds of Rebecca's morning routine, or her playing videos on her phone, or her complaining about being tired. I got up and made coffee in the clean kitchen. Every surface stayed exactly how I left it. No dishes appeared overnight. No shopping bags materialized on the couch. I ate breakfast at the table and washed my plate immediately after. The simple act of maintaining order felt better than anything had in years. I left for work and came home that evening to find everything still clean. This was what normal felt like. 3 days into the separation, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a woman's voice asked if I was Rebecca's husband. Who's calling? She identified herself as Rebecca's therapist. My jaw tightened. You shouldn't be calling me directly. She used her therapy voice, all calm and understanding. I'm concerned about Rebecca. She's experiencing severe anxiety due to the separation. She needs support right now, not abandonment. I walked to the kitchen and poured water. She needs to take responsibility for her actions. The therapist sighed. Anxiety is a real condition. Rebecca struggles with change and pressure. Forcing her out of her home has triggered a crisis. I gripped the glass harder. She didn't struggle with anxiety when she was shopping 4 times a week. The therapist's voice got firmer. That's not fair. Retail therapy is a coping mechanism. I laughed without humor. A coping mechanism that put us $45,000 in debt. She started to respond, but I cut her off. Contact my attorney if you have concerns. Her name is Danielle Pratt. I hung up before she could say anything else. When I told Danielle about the call later, she said it was inappropriate and possibly unethical. Therapists aren't supposed to contact spouses without consent. She's overstepping. I felt validated knowing even the therapist was out of line. Johnny came over on Saturday morning with his truck. Ready to finish this? We spent 4 hours boxing up everything Rebecca had left behind. Her clothes that didn't fit in her first trip, her collection of unused workout equipment, the decorative pillows she'd bought that cost more than groceries, the fancy kitchen gadgets still in their packaging. Every box represented money wasted and arguments avoided. Johnny loaded them into his truck bed while I sealed them with tape. You doing okay? I looked at the pile of boxes. Better than I've been in years, actually. He nodded. Good. You should have done this a long time ago, but better late than never. We drove to a storage facility on the edge of town. I rented the smallest unit they had, and we stacked Rebecca's boxes inside. The monthly fee was $60, but having her stuff completely out of my space was worth every penny. Johnny helped me change the locks on the house when we got back, just in case she tries to come back when you're at work. We finished as the sun was setting. He left, and I walked through my house looking at all the empty spaces where Rebecca's things used to be. It felt bigger somehow. Cleaner. Mine. Monday morning, I got a text from Chelsea. Rebecca wants to know if you'll pay for her therapy and beauty appointment since the separation is your fault and it's causing her emotional problems. I stared at the message for a full minute before forwarding it to Danielle. Her response came back in under 5 minutes. Absolutely not. I'll handle this. 20 minutes later, Chelsea texted again. Your lawyer is really rude. I didn't respond. Danielle called that afternoon. I told them you're not responsible for Rebecca's personal expenses and to stop making demands through third parties. If they have legitimate requests, they need to go through me. I thanked her and went back to work. That evening, Rebecca sent her own text. You used to care about me. Now you won't even help with basic necessities. I blocked her number like Danielle suggested and felt lighter immediately. Carlos posted the overtime schedule and I signed up for every available shift. My regular schedule was Monday through Friday, 8 hours a day. I added Saturday shifts and stayed late 3 nights a week. The extra money went straight to the credit card, starting with the one that had 22% interest. I made a payment of $800, the biggest payment I'd ever made, and watched the balance drop. It felt like chipping away at a mountain, but at least I was moving in the right direction. Each payment made the weight on my shoulders a little less heavy. I worked until my back ached and my hands cramped, but I kept going. Every box I lifted was one step closer to being free of the debt Rebecca created. By the end of the month, I'd paid off $1,500. The credit counselor called it excellent progress. I called it survival. 2 weeks later, Danielle called about the mediation session. The mediator wanted both of us in the same room to discuss splitting everything up. I showed up 15 minutes early to a plain office building with gray carpet and fluorescent lights that hummed too loud. Rebecca arrived right on time with Chelsea, who waited in the lobby giving me dirty looks through the glass door. The mediator was a woman in her 50s wearing a cardigan and glasses on a chain. She introduced herself and explained the ground rules. Rebecca started crying before we even sat down. She pulled tissues from her purse and dabbed at her eyes while the mediator waited patiently. We finally got started, and the mediator asked Rebecca to explain her position. She launched into a speech about how I kicked her out without warning and left her homeless and broke. I sat there listening to her rewrite history while the mediator took notes. The crying got louder when the mediator asked about the debt. Rebecca claimed she didn't know anything about the credit cards or how much money she spent. The mediator looked at me, and I pulled out the folder Danielle prepared. 3 years of statements showing every purchase. The mediator flipped through them slowly. Rebecca cried harder and said I was ambushing her with paperwork. The session ended after an hour with nothing decided because Rebecca refused to look at the numbers or discuss anything real. She just cried and said I was being cruel. The next day, Danielle met with Rebecca's lawyer at his office downtown. She brought copies of all the spending records and bank statements. I waited at work checking my phone every 10 minutes. Danielle called during my lunch break. Rebecca's lawyer looked at the documentation for 20 minutes without saying much. Then he stepped out of the room to talk to Rebecca privately. When he came back, he suggested to Danielle that Rebecca should probably accept a fair split instead of fighting. The spending pattern made Rebecca look bad, and a judge wouldn't be sympathetic. Danielle said Rebecca's lawyer seemed tired, like he knew his client was difficult and the case was weak. I felt something loosen in my chest. Maybe this would end without a huge court battle that cost money I didn't have. That weekend, Rebecca started posting on social media. Long paragraphs about being abandoned by a heartless husband who threw her out for no reason. She wrote about emotional abuse and financial control. Chelsea and her other friends left supportive comments calling me terrible names. I didn't respond or react. By Monday, 3 different people from work had sent me screenshots asking if I was okay. 2 guys I played basketball with in college messaged me privately. They both said basically the same thing. They weren't surprised. They'd seen how Rebecca acted at parties and gatherings over the years. One of them said his wife stopped inviting Rebecca to things because she only talked about shopping and never asked anyone else questions. Another friend from the warehouse said he remembered Rebecca showing up once, demanding I leave work early for some salon emergency. People had noticed. I just hadn't realized how many. I started looking at apartments that week. The house we rented cost $1,400 a month and I couldn't afford it alone, even with overtime. Plus, every room reminded me of arguments and disappointment. I spent my evenings after work scrolling through rental listings. Most places wanted first month, last month, and a security deposit. I did the math over and over trying to figure out what I could swing. Small studios were $800. 1-bedroom places ran $900 to $1,000. I needed something cheap and close to work to save on gas. I made a list of 5 possibilities and started calling landlords. Rebecca found out I was looking for apartments. Chelsea must have driven past the house and seen me loading boxes into my car because suddenly my phone exploded with messages. Rebecca said she wanted to come home and try again. She promised she'd changed and would do better with housework and spending. She sent 12 texts in a row about how marriage was worth fighting for and we shouldn't give up. I read them sitting in my car outside the warehouse before my shift started. Then I typed back one message. It was too late. I was done trying to fix something she never valued. She called immediately and I let it go to voicemail. She called 6 more times. I blocked her number again and went inside to work. The apartment hunt took another week. I looked at 3 places that were dumps with broken fixtures and stains on the carpet. Then I found a listing for a small complex near the warehouse. The landlord's name was Cornelius Brown, and he met me there on a Saturday morning. He was an older guy, maybe 60, who wore work boots and moved slow but steady. The complex had 8 units and mine would be on the first floor. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in. But it was clean. The carpet was new. The bathroom had been updated recently. The windows let in actual sunlight. Cornelius said the rent was $750 a month. I could walk to work in 20 minutes on nice days. I told him I'd take it and we shook hands. I paid the deposit and first month right there with money from my latest paycheck. Moving day was set for 2 weeks out. Johnny and Ryan both took the day off to help me move. I didn't have much. My clothes, some kitchen stuff, a TV, my air mattress. We loaded everything into Johnny's truck in under an hour. Most of what filled the old house belonged to Rebecca. The expensive couch, the Peloton, all the decorative pillows and throws and picture frames, box after box of shoes and purses and clothes, the fancy kitchen gadgets still in their packaging. I realized standing in that empty living room that I'd been living in Rebecca's space, not ours. My entire life fit in the back of a pickup truck. We drove to the new apartment and unloaded in 30 minutes. Johnny brought sandwiches and we sat on the floor eating lunch in my empty living room. Ryan said the place had good bones. Johnny said it was a fresh start. I said it felt like mine. Rebecca showed up that evening without warning. I was unpacking kitchen stuff when someone knocked hard on the door. I opened it, and there she stood wearing expensive sunglasses and holding her phone. She pushed past me into the apartment, looking around at the empty space. She wanted to know how I could afford this place. Her voice was sharp and accusing. I stayed calm and told her the truth. I could afford it because I wasn't supporting her shopping anymore. $750 a month was cheap compared to what her spending cost. She walked through the whole apartment like she was inspecting it. She checked the bedroom, looked in the bathroom, opened the fridge. Then she turned around and said this place was pathetic and I'd regret leaving her. She changed tactics fast. The anger dropped away, and suddenly she was soft and sad. She sat down on my air mattress and started talking about when we first met. Remember how happy we were? Remember that trip we took to the beach? Remember when we stayed up all night talking? Her voice got quiet, and she looked up at me with wet eyes. I stood in the doorway and let her finish. Then I reminded her that the person she was back then had a job. She had interests beyond spending money. She actually contributed to the relationship. That person disappeared 3 years ago and I didn't think she was coming back. Rebecca's face hardened again. She stood up and walked past me to the door. She said I'd be sorry and she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. My phone rang an hour after Rebecca left. Danielle's name showed up on the screen. I answered and she sounded pleased. Rebecca's lawyer called her that afternoon. He was pushing Rebecca hard to accept a settlement. The spending documentation made Rebecca look really bad, and they both knew it. Rebecca wanted to avoid going to court where a judge would see all those credit card statements. Danielle said we should expect a settlement offer within the week. She asked if I was ready to be done with this. I said I'd been ready for months. We talked through what a fair settlement might look like. Then I thanked her and hung up. I looked around my small empty apartment with its clean carpet and working appliances. The quiet felt good. No drama, no crying, no demands. Just space that was mine to fill however I wanted. The settlement papers came in the mail 3 days later. I sat at my small kitchen table reading through the legal terms while drinking coffee from a mug I'd bought for $2 at the thrift store. Rebecca would get half of what little we owned, which was mostly furniture she'd picked out anyway. The debt split caught my attention. Her lawyer proposed $30,000 of the $45,000 total would be her responsibility. I called Danielle and asked if we could push for $35,000 instead. She laughed and said she'd already planned to counter with that exact number. The spending records made it clear where the money went, and any judge looking at those credit card statements would see Rebecca's name on 90% of the charges. Danielle sent the counteroffer that afternoon. I went to work feeling lighter than I had in months, even though the warehouse was hot and the boxes seemed heavier than usual. Carlos asked if I wanted to grab lunch, and I said yes for the first time in weeks. We sat in his truck eating sandwiches from the corner deli, and he told me about his own divorce 5 years back. His ex-wife had drained their savings on a boyfriend she'd been seeing for 8 months. He said the worst part wasn't the money or the betrayal. It was realizing he'd ignored all the warning signs because he didn't want to face the truth. I understood that completely. Rebecca's response came back 2 days later. She refused the $35,000 split and demanded we stick to the original $30,000. Danielle called me at work during my break and explained that Rebecca's lawyer was probably advising her to take the deal, but Rebecca wasn't listening. She wanted to fight out of spite, not strategy. Danielle said we'd wait. Sometimes people needed time to realize they were making things worse for themselves. I went back to loading trucks and tried not to think about how much longer this might drag out. That night, Rebecca texted me directly for the first time in weeks. The message said her lawyer was being too negative, and she knew a judge would see things her way. She said I was trying to punish her for being a woman who valued self-care. I didn't respond. The next morning, Danielle called again. Rebecca's lawyer had apparently sat her down and walked through what would happen in court. A judge would look at 3 years of unemployment, credit card statements showing luxury purchases while bills went unpaid, and testimony about refusing basic household responsibilities. The lawyer told Rebecca she'd be lucky if a judge only assigned her $35,000 of the debt. She might end up with $40,000 or more. Rebecca agreed to the $35,000 split that afternoon. We scheduled the signing for the following Tuesday at Danielle's office. I took a half day off work and drove to the small building downtown where Danielle rented space. The waiting room had generic landscape paintings and magazines from 6 months ago. Rebecca arrived 10 minutes late with Chelsea, who sat in the corner glaring at me while Rebecca signed papers. Danielle walked us through each document, explaining what we were agreeing to. Rebecca cried through the entire process, her mascara running down her face in dark streaks. She kept pausing to wipe her eyes and blow her nose. When we got to the final signature page, she looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. She said she'd change for real this time if I gave her another chance. She said she understood now what I'd been trying to tell her. She said she'd get a job and stop spending and actually help around the house. Her voice cracked on every other word. I looked at her sitting there in a shirt that probably cost more than my weekly groceries and felt nothing but tired. I told her honestly that I didn't believe she'd change, and even if she did, I'd realized something important over the past few weeks. I was happier without her. The apartment was quiet and clean. My paycheck went toward paying off debt instead of funding shopping trips. I slept through the night without waking up anxious about money. I didn't want to go back to the stress and chaos, even if she promised to be different. Rebecca's face crumpled and she signed the last paper with a shaking hand. Chelsea stood up and took her arm, pulling her toward the door. Chelsea turned back and gave me a look that made it clear she thought I was the villain in this story. The door closed behind them, and I felt my shoulders relax. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. Danielle called me at work to tell me the judge had signed off on everything and it was officially over. I thanked her and hung up, then stood in the warehouse staring at a stack of boxes for a solid minute. That evening, I drove to a small Italian restaurant I'd passed 100 times but never entered because it seemed too expensive. I sat alone at a corner table and ordered chicken parmesan with a side salad. The food was good, not amazing, just solid and well prepared. I ate slowly and realized this was the first time I'd sat in a restaurant in months without calculating how much the meal cost and whether we could afford it. The check came to $23 with tip. I paid it without the usual spike of anxiety about the credit card bill. Walking back to my truck in the parking lot, I felt something close to peace. The next Monday at work, Carlos pulled me aside during our morning break. He said the current supervisor for the evening shift was retiring in 3 months, and they'd be posting the position internally. He asked if I'd be interested. The pay increase was $4 more per hour, which would add up to several hundred extra dollars each month. I could use that money to attack the remaining debt even faster. I told Carlos I was definitely interested. He nodded and said he'd put in a good word with the warehouse manager. The rest of the week, I found myself working with more focus and energy than I'd had in years. I wasn't dragging through shifts counting down the hours until I could go home and collapse. I was actually thinking about the work, finding more efficient ways to organize shipments and helping newer employees learn the systems. Carlos noticed. He stopped me on Friday afternoon and said he'd already talked to the manager about me. The conversation had gone well. Rebecca started texting me again about 2 weeks after the divorce finalized. The messages came late at night, usually after 11. Some were angry, calling me selfish and saying I'd abandoned her when she needed support. Some were sad, talking about how lonely she felt and how much she missed me. Some tried to be friendly and casual, asking how I was doing and mentioning things she'd seen that reminded her of me. I kept my responses short and factual. When she asked about getting some items she'd left behind, I told her to coordinate with Danielle. When she said she wanted to talk about what went wrong, I said there was nothing left to discuss. When she sent a long message at 2 a.m. about how she was in therapy and working on herself, I waited until morning and replied that I was glad she was getting help. I didn't engage with the emotional content or let myself get pulled back into conversations about our relationship. Danielle had warned me this might happen. She said some people couldn't accept that it was really over and would keep trying to maintain connection any way they could. The best approach was to stay polite but distant. Johnny called me in early November and asked what I was doing for Thanksgiving. I said I hadn't thought about it. He said his wife was hosting dinner for the family and I should come. His kids would be there. his parents, a few cousins. I hesitated because I hadn't spent a holiday with extended family in 3 years. Rebecca had always insisted we do Thanksgiving at expensive restaurants because she didn't want to cook and didn't want to deal with family drama. The restaurant meals had cost $200 or more and had left me stressed about money for weeks afterward. Johnny said his wife was making turkey and all the usual sides. Nothing fancy, just family gathering to eat too much food and watch football. I said yes. Hanging up the phone, I realized this was the first holiday in 3 years I was actually looking forward to, instead of dreading the cost and the drama and Rebecca's complaints about whatever wasn't perfect. The supervisor promotion came through in mid-December. The warehouse manager called me into his office and offered me the position starting January 1st. I accepted immediately. The pay increase was actually $4.50 per hour, slightly more than Carlos had mentioned. That added up to an extra $720 per month before taxes. I did the math in my head and realized I could be completely debt-free in 18 months instead of 3 years. That night I went to the bank and opened a separate savings account that only I had access to. I transferred $50 into it as a start. It felt good to see money going into savings instead of everything disappearing into debt payments and Rebecca's spending. The account was mine, under my name only, and nobody could touch it but me. I met with the credit counselor in February and brought all my updated statements. He pulled up my account on his computer and looked through the payment history for several minutes while I sat there waiting. Then he turned the monitor so I could see it and pointed at the projected timeline graph. According to his calculations, I was 3 months ahead of schedule on the debt repayment plan we'd set up back in October. If I kept making the same payments I'd been doing, I would be completely debt-free in 2 years instead of the original 4-year estimate. He asked what had changed, and I told him about the supervisor promotion and the overtime I'd been picking up. He nodded and said most people in my situation would have celebrated the extra income by loosening their budget, but I'd done the opposite and attacked the debt harder. That made all the difference. Walking out of his office, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride in myself. Real pride based on actual accomplishment instead of just surviving another day. Johnny called me the next week while I was eating lunch at the warehouse. He said Chelsea had told him something interesting. Rebecca finally got a job. She was working retail at one of the stores she used to shop at all the time, the one where she'd spent thousands on clothes and accessories. Chelsea said Rebecca didn't have a choice anymore because she couldn't pay her bills. The debt settlement had left her with $35,000 to pay off on her retail salary, and apparently reality had finally hit. Johnny said Chelsea mentioned that Rebecca was working full-time, 40 hours a week on her feet dealing with customers. I asked if Rebecca was complaining about it, and Johnny said actually no. According to Chelsea, Rebecca seemed tired but wasn't throwing her usual drama about how hard everything was. She was just doing the work because she had to. 3 weeks later, I ran into Rebecca at the grocery store. I was picking up vegetables and chicken for the week when I saw someone in the produce section who looked familiar but different. It took me a full 5 seconds to realize it was Rebecca. She had her natural brown hair instead of the expensive highlights. She wore plain jeans and a basic shirt instead of designer clothes. She looked tired. Really tired, with dark circles under her eyes and no makeup. She saw me at the same time and froze with a bag of apples in her hand. I walked over and said hello. She said hi back quietly. We stood there for a moment, and then she said the job was actually okay. She was learning things she'd never bothered to learn before, like how to budget and save money. She got paid every 2 weeks and had to make that money cover rent and food and bills with nothing left over for shopping or salons. It was hard, but she was managing. I asked how she was handling the debt, and she said she set up automatic payments so she couldn't skip them. Every month, a chunk of her paycheck went straight to the credit cards before she could touch it. She hated seeing that money disappear, but she understood now why I'd been so stressed all those years. We talked for another few minutes, and then she said something that surprised me. She apologized. Really apologized. Not the fake sorry she used to give when she wanted something. She said she understood now what I'd been dealing with. Working all day and coming home to a mess and having no money because someone else spent it all. She said she got it finally. Living it herself had taught her what 3 years of me explaining it never could. I told her I accepted her apology, and I was glad she was learning to take care of herself. Then I made it clear we weren't getting back together. She nodded and said she knew that. She wasn't asking to come back. She just wanted me to know she was sorry and she was trying to be better. We said goodbye and went our separate ways in the store. Walking to the checkout, I felt lighter somehow. The apology didn't fix anything, but it closed something that had been open. I started dating casually in March. Nothing serious, just coffee or dinner with women I met through work friends or online. The first date I went on was with someone named Lisa, who worked in logistics at a different company. We met for coffee and talked for 2 hours. She told me about her job and her hobbies and her goals for the next few years. She had her own apartment and her own car and her own money. She paid for her own coffee without expecting me to cover it. The conversation flowed naturally because we both had things to talk about beyond shopping and beauty treatments. She asked about my work and actually listened to the answers instead of changing the subject back to herself. I went on dates with a few other women over the next couple months and realized something. I enjoyed talking to women who had their own interests and careers. It was refreshing. It was eye-opening. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have a conversation with someone who contributed equally instead of just taking. My apartment felt like home by April. I'd lived there for 5 months and it had transformed from an empty space into my space. The furniture was basic but comfortable. The kitchen had supplies I actually used to cook real meals. The bathroom stayed clean because I cleaned it regularly. Everything in the apartment was paid for with money I earned and managed myself. No debt attached to any of it. The couch cost $200 from a discount furniture store instead of $4,000 on credit. The TV was a modest size I bought on sale instead of the biggest one available. The dishes were simple white plates from the dollar store instead of expensive designer sets. Walking in the door after work felt good instead of stressful. This was mine. Small and simple, but mine. Rebecca sent me a message in late April on what would have been our wedding anniversary. I saw the notification and almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was long. She thanked me for forcing her to face reality, even though she'd hated me for it at the time. She said getting kicked out and having to support herself had been the worst thing that ever happened to her, but also the best thing. She was in actual therapy now, not the kind where the therapist just validated everything she said. This therapist challenged her and made her look at her behavior honestly. She was learning about herself and why she'd acted the way she did. She said she had a long way to go, but she was trying. The message ended with her saying she didn't expect anything from me and wasn't trying to get back together. She just wanted me to know that leaving her had probably saved her life, even if it hadn't felt like it at the time. I read the message twice and then responded. I kept it short and kind. I told her I was glad she was getting real help and learning to take care of herself. I wished her well and meant it. Sending that message, I realized something important. I wasn't angry anymore. The anger that had burned in me for months after I packed her stuff was gone. It had faded so gradually I hadn't noticed it disappearing. Now I just felt grateful. Grateful I'd had the courage to walk away from something that was destroying me. Grateful I'd stood firm even when she cried and begged and threatened. Grateful I'd chosen myself for once instead of trying to fix someone who didn't want to be fixed. Carlos pulled me aside in early May and told me he was retiring at the end of the month. He'd been with the company for 32 years, and it was time to spend his days doing something other than managing warehouse operations. He said he'd already talked to the regional manager and recommended me for his position. The warehouse manager job came with another significant raise, better benefits, and a company vehicle for site visits. I would be managing the entire facility instead of just supervising one shift. Carlos said I'd earned it through hard work and dedication, and he trusted me to do the job right. 2 weeks later, I got called into a meeting with the regional manager who offered me the position officially. I accepted immediately. The pay increase was another $3 per hour plus quarterly bonuses based on facility performance. The benefits included better health insurance and a retirement matching program I could actually contribute to now. A year after Rebecca and I separated, I made the final payment on the credit card debt. The last card had a balance of $800, and I paid it off in full on a Friday afternoon in June. I logged into the account and watched the balance change to zero. Then I logged into the other cards and saw all zeros. Completely debt-free except for my car payment, which had 2 years left. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at those zero balances for a long time. $45,000 in debt, gone. Paid off through overtime shifts and careful budgeting and saying no to things I didn't need. I called Johnny and told him I wanted to take him and his family out to dinner that weekend. My treat, at a nice restaurant I could actually afford. He said I didn't have to do that, but I insisted. He'd helped me through the worst time of my life, and I wanted to say thank you properly. Saturday night I took Johnny, his wife, and their 2 kids to a steakhouse and paid for everything without stress or worry. The bill was $160, and I handed over my card knowing I had the money in my account to cover it. No debt, no panic, just a nice dinner with family who'd supported me when I needed it most. The company sent me to a regional logistics conference in Chicago 3 months after my promotion. I'd never been to something like this before, mostly just warehouse managers and coordinators from across the Midwest, talking about efficiency improvements and inventory systems. The hotel had one of those big conference rooms with round tables and terrible coffee. I sat down at a table near the back during the lunch break, and a woman about my age sat down across from me. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wore a simple blazer with no jewelry except a watch. She smiled and introduced herself as Amelie Doyle, logistics coordinator for a distribution company 2 states over. We started talking about the morning sessions and somehow ended up discussing everything else. She was funny and smart and had opinions about supply chain management that actually made sense. When lunch ended, we exchanged numbers, and she texted me that evening asking if I wanted to grab dinner since we were both stuck at the hotel anyway. We met at the restaurant downstairs and talked for 3 hours. She told me about her job and her apartment and how she was saving up to buy a condo. I told her about the divorce, and she didn't look at me with pity or judgment, just understanding. She said her ex-husband had been similar, always taking and never contributing, spending her money while she worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. She'd finally left him 2 years ago and rebuilt her life from scratch. The conference ended, but we kept texting, then calling, then video chatting most evenings after work. A month later, I drove 4 hours to visit her for the weekend. We went to dinner at a place she liked and walked around her neighborhood, and it felt easy, natural, like talking to someone who actually understood what partnership meant. She came to visit me the next weekend and met Johnny and his family. Johnny pulled me aside later and said he liked her, that she seemed solid and real. 3 months after the conference, we made it official. Emily and I were dating seriously, and neither of us saw the point in playing games or pretending we didn't care. One night at her place, I told her the full story about Rebecca. The shopping addiction, the refusal to work or clean, the $80,000 in debt, all of it. Emily listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said her ex had been the same way, just in different forms. He'd quit job after job claiming they didn't appreciate him while she paid all the bills. He'd promised to help around their apartment, but spent his days playing video games. She understood completely what it felt like to carry someone who refused to stand on their own. That conversation changed something between us. We both knew what we didn't want and what we did want. We wanted equal partnership, shared responsibility, someone who showed up. Johnny called me one afternoon 6 months into my relationship with Emily. He said Chelsea had told him something interesting. Rebecca was engaged. She'd met someone at the retail store where she worked, another employee who'd been there for years. They'd been dating for 4 months and he'd proposed last week. Chelsea said Rebecca seemed different now, actually happy in a genuine way instead of the manic shopping happiness. She and her fiancé were splitting bills 50-50. She did her own laundry and cooked meals and kept their apartment clean. Chelsea said Rebecca talked about her job like it mattered to her, about saving money for their wedding instead of blowing it on salon treatments. She'd apparently become the person she'd refused to be during our marriage. I sat with that information for a while. My first reaction surprised me because I wasn't angry or bitter. I was genuinely happy for her. Sometimes people need to hit rock bottom before they change, and our divorce had apparently been her rock bottom. She'd lost everything, had to move in with Chelsea, had to get a job for the first time in years, had to face reality without someone enabling her. And somehow that had forced her to grow up. I hoped it was real growth and not just temporary behavior. I hoped she'd learned something from our marriage falling apart. But mostly I hoped she was actually happy because I was happy, and there was no point in carrying around anger anymore. Emily moved in with me after 6 months of dating. She gave notice at her apartment, and we spent a weekend moving her stuff in with help from Ryan and Johnny. Her furniture was nice but modest, things she'd saved up for and bought herself. She had kitchen supplies that actually got used and books and plants that she kept alive. The first night she was officially living with me, we sat on the couch and she pulled out her laptop. She said we should start saving together for a house. She'd been saving on her own, but if we combined our efforts, we could have a down payment in 2 years. She opened a spreadsheet showing her calculations, how much we'd each contribute monthly, what neighborhoods we could afford, what kind of mortgage we'd qualify for. It felt incredible to be with someone who thought about our future as a partnership, who planned and saved and worked toward shared goals. We opened a joint savings account the next week and set up automatic transfers from both our paychecks. Every month I watched that balance grow and felt proud instead of anxious. This was money we were building together, not debt I was drowning in alone. 2 years after my divorce, Emily and I bought a house. It was small, just 3 bedrooms in a neighborhood 20 minutes from my warehouse, but it was ours. Both our names on the mortgage, both of us contributing equally to the down payment. We'd saved $30,000 together and put it down on a house that cost $160,000. The mortgage payment was less than what we'd been paying in rent for my apartment. We spent weekends painting rooms and fixing up the yard and picking out furniture together. Everything we bought we discussed and agreed on. Nothing appeared on a credit card as a surprise. Emily got promoted at her company to senior logistics coordinator with a significant raise. I got promoted to regional warehouse manager overseeing 3 locations across the state. The job was demanding, lots of travel and problem solving and managing multiple teams, but it was rewarding. I had a partner who supported my career while building her own, instead of someone who resented me for working. We got married on a Saturday afternoon in October, 3 years after we met. Simple ceremony at a small venue with close friends and family. Emily wore a dress she'd picked out herself that cost $300 and looked beautiful. I wore a suit I already owned. Johnny gave a speech about how far I'd come from that exhausted guy who finally stood up for himself 3 years ago. He talked about watching me struggle under weight that wasn't mine to carry and how proud he was when I finally put it down. Emily's parents gave a speech about how happy they were that their daughter found someone who treated her as an equal partner. We had dinner and dancing and left by 9 because neither of us liked being the center of attention for too long. The whole wedding cost $8,000 that we'd saved for specifically and paid in full. No debt, no stress, just a good day celebrating with people we cared about. A week after the wedding, a card arrived in the mail. Rebecca's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a congratulations card with a genuine message saying she was glad I found someone who appreciated me. She said she was sorry for how things ended between us and grateful that I'd forced her to face reality, even though she'd hated me for it at the time. She was married now, too, and finally understood what partnership actually meant. I showed the card to Emily and told her I appreciated the gesture and the growth it represented. Emily said it took courage to send something like that, and she respected Rebecca for doing it. We put the card in a drawer and moved on with our lives. 3 years after my divorce, I was living in a house I co-owned with an equal partner, completely debt-free. Thriving in my career, genuinely happy. I woke up every morning next to someone who pulled her own weight and expected me to pull mine. We split chores and bills and decisions. We talked about problems instead of avoiding them. We saved money and planned for the future and supported each other's goals. Walking away from that toxic situation with Rebecca had been the hardest decision I'd ever made. Standing in that clean house with her packed boxes knowing I was about to blow up my marriage and face the unknown. But it was also the best decision I'd ever made. Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. Sometimes you have to choose yourself even when everyone tells you that's selfish. I chose myself and built a life worth living. That's all any of us can do.